I think that's our cue. Welcome, ladies and gentlemen, and everyone who is watching. However, you may identify, we are so pleased you have joined us. My name is Ken Lima Coelho. I'm the Vice President, Community Engagement for YMCA Calgary, and it is my pleasure to be the MC, moderator, host, and stick handler of this virtual conversation. Now, I assume, because I've seen it 3 times, that you've enjoyed the film. Warrior Fathers is a beautiful production. So proud to be a part of this conversation about it. Momentarily, you're going to meet that guy. Oh, this guy. Where is he? This guy, the star on my screen at least. That's Thomas. We're going to talk about him in a moment. You're going to meet Chris, our filmmaker. You're going to meet Tim Fox. More to come. But let me just give you just a few little details to orient us a little bit. Of course, Warrior Fathers is a wonderful collaboration as part of Aboriginal Awareness Week, which we are in, and June being National Indigenous History Month. So we're proud that this is one of the collaborations of many that are happening in our community around this. A whole bunch of people have brought this, and organizations have brought this together, but really it's the Boys and Girls Clubs of Calgary that we have hand to heart, as Tim would say, for bringing us together, the Indigenous Initiatives team there, and some other sponsors that have become involved over the last little while. The Calgary Foundation, Calgary Queer Arts Society, Hidden Story Productions, our friends at TD Bank, Zerb TV, which you watched the video on, and YMCA Calgary. So let me start with a land acknowledgement, and I'm going to be vulnerable with you in a moment because I've got so many wonderful voices around the table here, the virtual table, and I reached out to my friend Tim and said, Tim, how should I approach a land acknowledgement? And his answer was just wonderful. He said, be authentic, be yourself, and tell the story you want to tell around why land acknowledgement is important to you. So I was thinking about that, and it took me to just an experience I had yesterday. I was waiting for my son just yesterday at North Glenmore Park. My son's in the room right back there playing video games, by the way. He's 15 years old. He was out with some buddies, and I was waiting for him. And I was looking, if you can picture North Glenmore Park in Calgary, I was looking out at this beautiful escarpment. There was a gentle rain falling, a wonderful valley below, beautiful night. A bird of prey was gently swooping overhead. It was a picturesque and perfect moment. And it was really quiet. And in that quiet, I felt a profound sense of peace and of being tied to our land. This very land that has been a place of connection for people for thousands of years. And that moment really reminded me that I have a responsibility to remember I'm just a traveler on this land right now, and that many of us have come before, and many, many will come after. And it's my role, it's our role, to do things right now in a good way. And while I'm here on this land and in this time, that is my responsibility, and I think it's a shared one. So all of the partners in today's event know and share a commitment that reconciliation starts with acknowledging our honor and privilege to live and work within this beautiful land, within the Treaty 7 territory. We acknowledge the traditional territories and oral practices of the Blackfoot Nations, which include Siksika, the Piikani, and the Kainai. We also acknowledge the Tsuut'ina and Stoney Nakoda, which includes the Chiniki, Bearspaw, and Wesley First Nations. In addition, the city of Calgary is home to the Métis Nation of Alberta Region 3. And finally, we acknowledge all nations, genders, and spirits who live, work, and play in Mohkinstsis, the Blackfoot name, of course, for Calgary and Treaty 7 region of southern Alberta, who help us steward this land, honor, and celebrate this territory. We, of course, are all treaty people. So that is my way of acknowledging the land, but we have a very special opportunity right now to be blessed, a blessing and a prayer offered to us by Thomas Snow's mom. Her name is Alice Kakwitz, and she's standing by, and I think Thomas is going to go get his mom to provide a blessing. Thomas.
Thank you, Ken. I'm going to offer my mom this giant coin. No, it's actually tobacco. To offer a prayer for a lot of what's going on in the world, for the people that are struggling, for all the dads out there, for the moms that are taking the role of dads, for the dads that are doing the best they can, for the children of all races and colors. This can be challenging, so I want to start this off with a prayer and a blessing from my mother as a gift to the world. Dagun mapizanine asiagiatine dagun gitahibina na ainchip tagabiza na ugi hibisinzi muhanchi changi gabichas.
Sin tiwagyak watana wagima tatnangu kankushkabitu kare bijiko. I know wadinkane akinanga ha. Ihno ambado huaste ngak binencho ha. No hechu wahuchitan ichigyat. No nanga ha. Ihno duhuaste hanencho ha. Ihno ne waham chakia bitinchien. No akida bihna edaha uchitachi. Ihno na pejabiktene unchagia ichigia. No nangu nen manko chintanga nenis daguwas. Ihno unkahna. No kopaya hana dana. Ihno chashtabi donangabine. Nungi tehibines unchagia ichigia. No tugada pagia biktene nangu aktun chaya bines. No aktun tabi snugia ihno ashaga. No taunka ugagi kaminchien achigis. No nangu hunun chabines ihno zeis ihno chagia. Hukshunji hiabine. Nangun chastabi do nangabines ihno gitahibita. No mimi hene kikseo mani mihna. No inchikya mishihna da inchina wuste inchina. No inchik mushkia ambo mani minchien uchagia. No makuchitanga le winra. No inchasta do nangane udnumba unchasta le ihno uchagia. No nangu ikushibir no home pakusane happy on yabi amba on yabi. No indu kidney kubines no engegio no nis shabi linkubits newakne no ingogiabi nane data simine egidichevichin ukshi windi hiabi no aktun chabi. No inchabine no dungo tangabine. No ye anjang chingi hamne washagabi unchaku ichiyat nihangane. No jena huchitaich ishnis paka niukimat nanguni tangaribis ishnis.
Thank you very much, Alice. That was beautiful. We're going to be talking a little bit more about language. I know Thomas understood every word there, and maybe we didn't, but we caught the intention, I believe, and we'll talk more about that as we. Okay, a couple of things. Usually this is the point where the MC gives you sort of housekeeping. Well, we don't have to worry about where the washrooms are. You probably know where they are in your place. But I did want to remind everybody that we're trying to create a bit of a brave space here to help guide our intentions on the tone and the sort of connection that we'd like to create together. And so Tim, once again, one of my wise friends, gave us a few principles in which to exist in a brave space. And I'd like to read them to you because I think they're an important way for us to frame the conversation we're going to have, because it might be a challenging one, and there's some pretty interesting but also difficult potential themes that might surface. So we want to be present in the room and with each other. And the room is this virtual space. We're open to new ideas, new ways of thinking, and to feedback. We listen deeply and seek new knowledges and understanding. We're curious and hold a willingness to have our minds change. We're aware and bring awareness to our biases, assumptions, and judgments. We hold a space of trust and confidentiality. We focus on possibility and see obstacles as opportunities for learning. We hold brave space for courageous conversations, and I know we'll have one of those today. We challenge ideas, not people. We allow discomfort to lead our growth, and we take accountability for our own learning. So that's what we are looking to do in organizing this conversation in all the meetings we had previous to this. That's where we held ourselves, and I'm excited to hold ourselves to that in this way as well. You'll also remember there's a chat function. You will see somewhere on your screen. We're already seeing comments from Mallory, who really liked your film. Chris and Thomas, good job. Jessica Bolduc has joined us. Jessica, wow, 4 hours. She's here. Now I'm intimidated. Wow, Jessica is amazing. The Boys and Girls Club. Anyway, you can put your chats and your questions when we get to that part of things in the comments, and we'll navigate as many as we can before 5 o'clock. All right, a couple of other things. If I'm glancing down, it's because I've got a second screen here, because I have 2 fancy screens like Chris does launching the space shuttle over there. Not because I'm not paying attention, I'm just looking at a second screen, which is in my lap. All right, let's meet our panelists. Chris Shunk. Chris is an engineer turned documentary filmmaker. He's the producer and, of course, a panelist here. Documentary media was the right blend of the technical, creative, and intellectual for Chris. And boy, has he run with it. His time spent on reserves ultimately led him to produce and direct his first feature film, and you might have seen a trailer of it just before Warrior Fathers, Elder in the Making, which was so successful, a film that premiered at the Calgary International Film Festival, won Best Feature Documentary in Alberta. It's been used all over the country, certainly the province, probably the country, for learning. It's been used at the YMCA, so thank you very much, Chris. And gosh, he's made over 30 short documentary films and is involved in all sorts of interesting projects in the museum world and other things. And he's also produced several documentaries for broadcast at my old employer, the good old CBC. So that's Chris. Give him a wave, Chris, so they know you're here. There he is. Let's talk about Thomas. We don't need to really introduce Thomas. You've just watched a beautiful film about Thomas. But I'll tell you a couple of other things. He's a dad, shocker, member of the Stoney Nakoda Sioux Nation and fluent speaker of Nakota Sioux. Thomas's passions center on preserving and teaching Nakota culture and language, and he co-hosts the radio show Conversational Nakota with his mom, Alice, and that happens on Windspeaker Radio, which is FM 88.1. Graduate at the University of Calgary, helper in his community wherever he can, and he attends and helps with ceremony, including MC duties. So if I mess this up, Thomas, you take over. And many other community-related activities. Thomas has received and carries 3 eagle feathers from his nation as a medal for bravery from the Calgary Fire Department. And I'm sure that's a pretty interesting story. We'll hear another time. Finally, our panelist, Tim Fox. Tim is a proud member of the Blackfoot Confederacy from the Blood, or Ghana Reserve, located 2 hours south of Calgary. Tim has lived and worked in Calgary for the past 15 years, although he still considers the home fires of the Blood Reserve where he truly belongs. The Vice President of Indigenous Relations with the Calgary Foundation. He is the proud father of a 9-year-old named Charm. She's around somewhere, and very active in his community. So welcome, everybody. Welcome all. How's everybody doing?
Great.
Great. Mostly that was a mic test to make sure we could hear you all. There you go. All right, start. Maybe I'm going to start with. Let me start with Chris. Chris, what did you see in Thomas's journey and his story that told you, "Gee, to be told"?
Well, for me, I think I'm pretty sure it happened over a coffee. Actually, Thomas and I were just having coffee, talking about life, talking about being a dad. I think at that time my son was less than a year old. And it struck me that there aren't that many films about dads, and for the most part, how they're represented is either as a goofy kind of character who doesn't seem to know what he's doing, or it's kind of like the absent dad story, right? Or usually there's like some kind of action hero, and he doesn't really like hang around for that kind of stuff. So I really felt like there was this space to tell a story about an Indigenous dad, but also just about a dad in general, just trying to figure out how to pass on the best of his culture to his son. And for me, that was something that really struck me because, I have a Chinese background, and I want to be able to pass some of the language, some of the cultural aspects of it to my son as well too. And I wasn't quite sure how to do that because I grew up Canadian. I'm mostly Canadian, I would say, with a bit of Chinese. So that's what really drew me to the story.
We're all dads on this panel. I know we all have kids, and I'm sure we'll talk about it. There are so many themes that came up in your film, Chris, but we are going to zero in on the notion of fatherhood, because obviously Father's Day is close, and that's the focus we've taken. But Thomas, you decided to lend yourself, your best self, to making this film. You thought you were just having a coffee, and now look. Tell me, what was it about this opportunity that attracted you to lend yourself and open yourself up this way?
Yeah, well, Chris is just an amazing person, first of all. He's so warm and kind and thoughtful. But when he wanted to bring a camera, I thought, well, yeah, why not? I went with it, just like the fight. When Chris said we should do this, I said, okay, let's do it. Let's do the best we can. That being said, I think, yeah, Chris highlighted all the good parts. I don't think in the whole film, I think the caption was, "I'm so tired." It was just because that's just how it is. In my bio, I just real quickly wanted to point out that I wanted to say hello to my daughter, Callie, and my son, Tatape. They're not in the film, but they're always in my heart, constantly thinking about them, as well as, of course, Yornau and Ianco. I really wanted to create something for my family, for dads out there, for my brothers, my cousins, and for my sons, really.
That's great. Tim, you too are an Indigenous father to that wonderful little girl. What resonated for you particularly in this film?
Oh man, so many things resonated for me. I think what I really appreciated, and I think I've told Thomas this before, but just to publicly thank you for making yourself so vulnerable and allowing those cameras into your life. I know that couldn't have been easy to do, so thank you for holding on to that space and that platform, because you had a really strong message to share. What resonated with me was the challenge that you highlighted around the importance of cultural connection when you're an Indigenous father and trying to find ways to incorporate those values and beliefs into how you raise your children. But it's more of a challenge when you're living in an urban center, just because you're surrounded by so many colonial constructs that, as we're seeing today, have a deep impact on Indigenous people in general. So I really appreciated you surfacing that truth in the movie. In the documentary, one of my favorite parts of the documentary was the naming of your child and how you sort of showcased that, because that was a significant moment in my life when Charm was named Nadawe Pyoyaki, and she was 3 months old when that happened, and it was the result of her getting extremely ill and sick, and she was in the hospital for about a week. We didn't know what was happening. And we had my elders, my traditional mothers, my Aunt Bernadette and my mother Connie, who really enforced when she did get sick that when she gets healthy, it was a priority for us to take her back home so that she could receive that name. There's been such a disruption to our cultural ways throughout our shared history that we're entering into a time where it's so crucial as parents of Indigenous children to have those really hard conversations and unfortunately prepare them for a world that still struggles on ways to prioritize the work of reconciliation and right relations. And so I think this documentary has amplified that effort for all parents. So,
You raised so much there, Tim, but it gets to the heart of something that really is central to the film. As a young Indigenous father, how do you develop or learn about the role of a good dad? So we're going to talk about that in a minute, but I really wanted to zero in on what you're talking about around colonial constructs. Thomas, what were some of the challenges that you've been navigating as an Indigenous father in knowing that there are these constructs that are beating down at you at every turn, but wanting to raise your sons and your kids in a way that's meaningful for your culture?
Well, there's this thing called an economy, and if you give your time, then you get money in return, which makes no sense to me, because I think this land has more than enough to really support all of us. But in that economy structure, what you're giving away is your time, but also your life. And we train our children to do this as well. They call them schools, and we send them off, and that detaches us from them. And schools aren't always a place that nurture their nari, their spirit. And in our traditional teachings, that nurturing of the nari was a communal responsibility. And so what I see is this Western colonial structure essentially killing the nari of children, of adults, of grandparents, as well as everything that surrounds that: language, culture, love, relationships. It disconnects parents, mothers and fathers, and children from mothers. So there's a lot within the colonial structure that harms not just Indigenous people, but all people, really.
Amber, one of the people in the live chat, just said the baby naming scene in the film brought tears to her eyes. So beautiful, she says, a fantastic example of the value of the entire community raising a child. While you were making this film, Chris, were you looking for those moments of community? Obviously, we were zeroing in on one particular family, but there was a broader narrative at play here.
Yeah, no, for sure. I mean, it's interesting. I don't know if people notice that the title of the film is Warrior Fathers, right? And so that was intentional because there was a sense that, okay, is it at first it was Warrior Father, but then as we explored this idea of what it means to be a father, and then realized that Thomas was referencing many other fathers, whether it's uncles, whether it's grandfathers, and aunties of course too, but there is a sense that parenting is more than just in one person, that it is part of like a whole community that raises that. And certainly for myself, there's a way in which and even in Chinese culture, there's a sense that the extended family is part of like the parenting as well too. And it's only here in Western society where there's this idea of a nuclear family where you have two parents and a kid, and that's the family. And funnily enough, even my parents have kind of bought into that, right? They even said, it's like, oh, when we grow old, we'll stay out of your way while we'll be in a home somewhere and things like that. And I'm actually want to go back to what probably they were raised, which is that the grandparents live with the family, and that idea of the extended family can actually be very rich, not only for my son, but can also be a really rich experience for my parents as well too. So that it's very clear from the outset that no, this is a community thing. Parenting is much more than one person. It is everybody that's involved in the child's life.
Tim, I'm going to ask you a question in a moment, but I'd like to invite anybody who would like to ask a question, make a comment in the chat, to please do that. As long as they're respectful in the agreement we've made, we would love to hear what you're thinking. And while we're doing that, Tim, who taught you about the sense of family and how to, maybe it was a person, maybe it was a community, but how did you learn to be a dad?
Oh man, I feel like I'm still learning to this day. I'm not sure that if you are a parent and you feel like you have arrived, that there's probably a lot more work you have to do. I think one thing that I'll expand on from what Chris said is that from an Indigenous perspective, our family concept does go beyond that nuclear perception and lens that we have. And I definitely grew up with that same paradigm of thought. And my parents struggled. My parents struggled with, the challenges of substance abuse and domestic violence. But thankfully, I had the traditional family structure to lean back on, where I had other moms and other dads who were a lot more further along in their healing journeys and connected to ceremony and all that kind of stuff. So I realized the concept of a community of kin at a very young age, which I think was large in part sort of some of my saving grace. Later on in life, I grew up very resentful towards my parents, and it was only because I didn't understand this history that we talk about and impacts of intergenerational trauma that I did sort of have a broken relationship with my immediate parents. But thankfully, I had that sort of traditional family concept to fall back on. And now through the work that I'm doing around truth and reconciliation and decolonization, this light bulb went off in my head, I don't know, maybe 5-10 years ago. And I reflected and I'm like, wow, my childhood experience growing up was just a fraction of what my parents had to go through as children themselves. And that empowered me to rebuild the relationship that I have with my parents. And now to this day, I'm so proud and happy to say that I have an incredibly close relationship to my parents. And all of the resentment that I held onto and that was sort of feeding at my spirit and damaging it sort of was lifted. And even to this day, no one's perfect. I don't claim to be perfect, nor do I claim that my parents are perfect. But at least I have this level of understanding that those little things that would cause fights and resentment no longer exist. Biologically, I have one daughter, but in a traditional sense, I have many other children in my life because I look at my sister's children and my brother's children as my own children as well. And that's a value that I learned at a really young age.
Thomas, I see you agreeing. What did you want to say in response?
Well, I grew up in a very similar way, where my uncles called me Michis. Like all of my family members never use my name. You'll never hear Thomas out in Morley or wherever I go. You'll never hear my family saying that. They'll always refer to me as son, brother, grandson in our language. And so, yeah, I don't think I ever heard my name in my community unless it was I was being introduced or something. And even then, they still call me by cousin or something. But just to build on what Tim said, I think there's something about being a parent yourself that really it really made me look at and understand those resentments I had towards my parents. And really it's a humility, it's an empathy. It's a shared understanding that even, that they were doing the best they could. And if anything, I feel incredibly privileged now to have access to all this technology, to have access to all these resources in a way that my parents didn't, even about discussions around colonization, around trauma work, around healing, even around parenting. It's the amount of literature and research out there that's accessible. It's nothing like what my parents had. My parents had a very traditional way of child rearing that I'm actually very grateful for, because it gives me something to build upon in a lot of ways.
That actually picks up on a couple of questions that we've got in the chat here that I'll read one from Brian Hill. He says, in the film, Thomas talks about finding a creative balance between the traditional and the modern, as you were just talking about. And this is a neat twist on it. What are your favorite things to do with your kids to integrate those traditional and modern ways? How do you make that come alive, Thomas?
The easiest one, to be honest, is free. It's called a walk. It's just go outside, because I don't think we value the land enough or recognize its value. We really don't. We think that the phones or the computers are more important, but we can't recreate what the land does. And I think that's my most important thing, is actually getting them out on the land and into these spaces that their ancestors walked. And then because then I can use my language more. It's hard to use it when there's Blippy on constantly and Paw Patrol and they're in their 8th reiteration with superpowers now. I can try to name that, but if I get them outside, then the language comes alive. And I think that's really my biggest thing, my favorite.
Chris, I noticed when you put the film together, and there's a beautiful scene where Thomas is taking a walk, and there was more than one, but the one I noticed was when you were walking, you were thinking about the trees and how we put those things around the bases of the trees. I was walking with my kids in a park just 2 weeks ago, and I will never look at trees the same way now that you've pointed that out. It's like, what are you trying to do with the outdoor scenes, Chris? And that was your attempt, it seems, and a successful one, to connect Thomas's way of parenting to that land.
Yeah, and actually I think this is a great time to talk about a scene that I really, really wanted to be in the film, but I just couldn't make it fit because
Tell us.
Fit in the 45 minutes. Thomas, remember, like we had a whole segment scene about your backyard. and basically it started off with this whole conversation around lawns and how like it's such a waste of space and time, and I had asked Thomas, like, oh, I like your backyard, it's so like wild and it's overgrown, and it's like what started that? And it started off just because he's a little bit lazy, just he's like, I don't want to mow this lawn and feed it, but then you realize, like as the grass grew, it actually became more like the grass that I would see like on the reserve, like when we were just walking in the forest. It actually felt like it was living, the grass was living the life it was meant to live, which is to be long and have this sort of like rich like ecosystem, little mini ecosystem to it. And as it turns out, it's more fun for the kids.
Yeah.
And that was despite Shalom sort of initially like not really appreciating that. So I have actually taken that and actually applied it to my backyard. My strategy here is that the front yard, I'll keep it all nice and trimmed and weeded, so it looks like everybody else's house and people don't call the police on me. But like in the backyard, I'm just letting everything grow, and maybe like trimming a little bit here and there, but really just being curious about like, well, what does grow other than grass, or is grass actually like the native thing that grows everywhere, right? And I'm realizing it's just way more interesting for Xavier.
I like it. It's like a lawn mullet, trimmed in the already in the back. Right?
Yeah,
Tim,
that's right.
as an extension to that, one of the questioners asked about ceremony. How does ceremony connect into your parenting and to what you expose your daughter to? And how difficult is that to do in an urban context?
It could be challenging if you sort of don't really tap into your own internal energy, just because I feel like I'm not as fortunate enough to be connected or living in the same city as my parents or my grandparents. I'm living in the city, but that doesn't still stop me from connecting to the land, like Thomas was saying. Or I had this realization that we're sort of up against a couple of things. We're up against this societal perspective of toxic masculinity, first of all, and then we're up against the impacts of intergenerational trauma that we are impacted by as a people. And so for me, I felt like I wanted to break that cycle, and I wanted to be in this 100%. I didn't want to go to the traditional norms of what a dad does and what a mom does or what they're supposed to be responsible for. I wanted to contribute 100% to the physical, mental, spiritual, and emotional upbringing of my child. And so we still sort of tap into our cultural practices of smudge when we're addressing the balance of our own individual medicine wheel. And I know the medicine wheel varies from nation to nation, but I think the consistent thing is to keep that balance. And so that's sort of the lens that I try to incorporate when I lean on cultural revitalization for my daughter. An impact of intergenerational trauma for me was that my parents never did speak to us fluently in Blackfoot. Later on in life, they are fluent speakers and they will speak to us, but I didn't pick up the language. So it's important for me to expose my daughter to celebratory things in our culture like powwow. She loves to dance. She often connects with my father on the land, and my dad tells her stories, and I'll sort of hear them from an earshot, and my dad will be telling her a story. And one time I asked Charm, I was like, Charm, do you listen to Papa when he tells you his stories and all that kind of stuff? And she sort of hummed and hawed and all that kind of stuff. And I don't think she was really paying attention. And so I shared with her that I really wish that my grandmother Emma was still alive and she would tell me stories, but I didn't pay as much attention as I should have, because there are some really important life lessons in those stories that they teach us. And so I'm really trying to encourage my daughter to, sort of pay extra attention when Papa's telling her those stories. But any chance I get to tap into my sort of internal energy in the city, it still offers many ways to connect my daughter to our culture.
And let's get this straight. You took this so seriously. You wrote a book. You wrote a children's book.
I did.
Tell us about that. Come on, we got to plug your book. Tell us about your book.
Well, it sort of happened by accident, and Thomas was a part of the process as well, where we were invited to participate in a 2-week-long writer's workshop with Richard Van Camp. And I sort of cleared the time with work, and I like to write in general, and participated day one of the workshop. We found out, oh, hey, by the way, you're going to write children's books based on stories that were told to you as children. And so my book is called Napi Ki Imita, Napi and the Dogs. And it's a creation story that was told by my mother. My mother was once an interpreter at the Head Smashed in Buffalo Jump. And I remember her telling me the story about dogs. I'm not going to ruin it for you just because there's a story and there's a lesson of why dogs are the way they are today. So I'll leave it at that, but that's sort of how that happened.
Well, you just sold a book, Janet. I find this book. So somebody put up the information. Jessica Bolduc has asked a big question. I'm going to get to it in a minute, Jessica, in honor of you. But first, I want to talk to Thomas a little bit and Chris about boxing. That was a twist for me. I didn't see that coming. When I first watched the film. Talk to me about the sport, but more importantly, talk to me about how there seems to be a bit of a triangle forming between you as a boxer, Thomas, you as a father, and you as an Indigenous man. Tell me about the triangle, if I've gotten that right.
Well, I think it caught us all off guard when we started filming it. It was really just a way for me to get outside the house, get to the local YMCA, sign up for a class. But when I started to get into it, it really was more about, there was more under the surface, right? It was about, as an Indigenous man, we're often portrayed as violent, dangerous, angry. And when you look at the history of colonization in Canada, you would think to yourself, well, why wouldn't we be? And this world is a dangerous place for Indigenous people. People, just within the past month, 8 people have been killed, 8 Indigenous people across this country. So that's the world that I live in. That's the world that Tim lives in. It's the world our children live in, our aunties, our uncles, our grandmothers, our grandparents, because they don't discriminate. They'll go after elders too. They'll go after chiefs. So in that, knowing that that's the world that we live in, I understand the importance of discipline and strength. And those are things that I have to emulate. I have to practice. I want my sons to witness them. Something that's not in the film is I would lift weights in my basement with my son watching, with Bubba watching. And after a while, he started to watch how I did even a deadlift or a squat. And he would copy those movements. And so in that way, he became stronger and stronger just by watching them. A big part of it is having the ability to defend my children, my life, if needed, but not being a violent person. Because when I get in there, I'm not trying to get out anger and aggression. I'm trying to find peace.
Chris, you could have pulled on many metaphors. Thomas is such a multi-layered and fascinating person. Why did you choose that sport and boxing?
Well, I mean, I didn't choose the sport. I guess the sport chose Thomas. But but I think actually I might address this question and actually jump a little bit ahead to Jessica's question. Is this whole concept about being a warrior? Thomas and I had lots of conversations about toxic masculinity because there was this sense of like that what it means to be a man is to be like macho, to be tough, to be able to be violent. And actually, I was actually quite disappointed to see, like with the police, that they talk about how the police training is very much of a warrior mentality, and they take a militaristic kind of approach to policing, at least in the U.S., where in terms of how they train, and I actually reject that definition of being a warrior, because to me, a warrior is somebody who has firmly they do know how to use force, but their goal is to protect the community. And in a sense, it's like a warrior can be a father. And you think about the difference between what a soldier does and what a warrior does, you might see some of the difference in direction and intention. And to me, that this idea of a warrior is something that also reflects fighting against some of those stereotypes of that what a dad or what a male should be in society, and points more towards like the connection to, like, caring for community. Even just something I remember listening to a person talking about again, like what this whole movement towards defunding the police and looking at like what would be an appropriate use of police, or what would actually be a better metaphor for dealing with conflict and things that need to help. And he felt that, in a lot of communities, including traditional Chinese communities, like it's often like the grandmother or the grandfather that acts as the person that negotiates or does the conflict resolution, because so many situations don't require coming in with a gun, or and so what if there was this idea that a warrior can be a grandfather, right? Like it doesn't have to be a soldier. So yeah, I don't know. There was just something really powerful about that concept. And of course, I didn't know that this would happen at that time, but we were definitely getting at that core of like, what does it mean to be a man? What does it mean to be a father?
Yeah, there was certainly, for me, a resonance in watching this film at this moment in history, at this inflection point with all of what we are looking at and watching and absorbing. Tim, how did that play out for you? And in honor of Jessica's question, in a global context, how does fatherhood help create the structures that we can navigate this really difficult moment?
Well, when I think about that question, I think about Indigenous paradigms of thought and practice in general, in that a lot of there's change needed in all of our institutions, just because there is one dominant narrative that has built the infrastructures of society that we're sort of battling against right now. So I'm of the belief that there's so much that we can learn off of the wisdom of Indigenous people when it comes to justice specifically, that we did have structures of justice and community policing in our communities where it didn't involve sort of aggression or brutal force. It was a lot more, it was handled in less violent ways. And so I feel like there is a lot to be learned and a lot to be gained off of the governance structure of how Indigenous people function, our hereditary sort of governing structures when it comes to fathers. Again, I feel like fathers in this day and age, Indigenous fathers in this day and age, still struggle. Sometimes we're still wounded spirits. And if I were to go back to myself as a child and tell myself a message, I would say, get rid of those limiting beliefs about your father and know that he loves you and he's going through some really hard things in his life that he has not overcome. And the things that you are believing about him and yourself and your people, to get rid of them, is what I would tell myself. And I would encourage my childhood self to embrace the community that I come from, because it is full of love and positivity and structure that places like police departments and police stations and other settler-created organizations and institutions can really learn a lot from, when it comes to how we sort of embrace social justice and equality.
Thank you for that, the richness of that conversation. We've got about 15 minutes left, so I wanted everybody to know that if you've got questions, Boys and Girls Club just posted all the information you could possibly need to know about Tim's book, so that's good news. This is a wonderful question that comes through the chat. Thomas, I'll direct it to you. What is some advice for new fathers, for new Indigenous fathers or racialized fathers who are experiencing some of the same adversities that you have, such as how to become motivated to find these outlets to connect their children to their sense of culture, to their cultural history? What are some of the tools you've talked about? Getting out into nature, you've talked about connecting to community. Give some good, solid advice to the many fathers that'll be watching right now.
Yeah, I'm always kind of cautious about this, because when Chris and I started the film, we didn't want to make a prescriptive film. We didn't want to say this is how you do it, because Indigenous cultures are so unique. And even within my own nation, Stoney Nakoda is composed of 3 separate nations, and within that there are many, many clans, and I just come from a couple of them. And each clan has its own way of doing things, of ceremony, and all of those, of course, being influenced by colonialism, by paternalism, by Christianity to an extent, and that's always a spectrum. And so for anyone going out there and trying to connect, I always caution people to understand that Christian influence, paternalism exists within Indigenous communities, and to keep that in mind. There's this idea of a mythology of elder, that an elder is an all-knowing, all-seeing, all-powerful source of wisdom and light. And I would argue that exists within each and every single one of us. And I'm not saying that it doesn't exist within elders, but understand that elders have been through something called the residential school system, and have been traumatized as children. And to always go into relationships with that in mind. I'm not saying be overly cautious, or just take the same care and caution that you would, as you have for your newborn child, and you are responsible for their nari, their spirit. Think of it in that way, and I don't think you can go wrong, as long as you're always putting the growth and intention and support, protection of that child spirit at the forefront. I don't think you can go wrong there. Of course, the openness, it can be challenging. So oftentimes I will even disagree with my elders on certain things, especially when it comes to paternalistic attitudes, and at times attitudes toward women, and the way that women's roles are seen, and the way that men's roles are seen. In the film, one of the things that I was blessed with was having as a partner Shalom Hope, who was as committed to this journey as I was, and she was willing to do the things that made it possible for me to be the primary person at home with the boys, including milking and going to work, because I'm not using formula in the films. Shalom is putting in the work of pumping and then storing the milk, which is an incredible job. It's incredibly challenging. I think that is far harder than any boxing match. Anything is the work of mothers, and they're literally giving their own life to raise their children. That can't be stated enough, or it can't be understated. So I would really always caution people, it's okay to examine these things. It doesn't make you less of a man either, right?
We've got about 10 minutes left, and I'm going to throw it open a little bit, because it's one thing for me to be asking questions, but I'd be curious what you want to know from each other. We don't often have this vulnerable and safe space where we can have conversations. Talk to each other. What do you want to know, Tim, as you watching Thomas's film, or Thomas, as you've been listening to Tim. Let's play a bit of a game here. I'm going to get out of the way. Let's start with you, Tim. You've got these amazing gentlemen with you. What do you want to know from them?
Well, I just really admire the language aspect of how Thomas is incorporating his traditional language into his parenting style. I really wish that I could have that, and so I'm on this learning journey of. My book is sort of written in half Blackfoot and half English. But what I guess advice would you say for other fathers who might be living in urban centers around speaking their language as little as they know? How would you sort of provide some motivation and some hope behind that it's not going to be extinct, and that we do have the power to have our languages survive?
Thomas, get them outside is one of your answers. I know that.
Get them outside, because the language lives in the world around us. It doesn't live on, well, it does kind of live online now. You can put it on YouTube. I know my sons watch Cree videos online. A big part of it is, one thing that I do is I learn how to learn. Because the thing is, when I'm living in the city, even as a fluent speaker, I still fall out of use with words, and I'm always challenging myself to use words, to incorporate them. I'm constantly asking my mom, how do I say this? Or can you remind me how to say this? And she's correcting me. And I never beat myself up for making mistakes. I mean, I have a radio show, and sometimes I mispronounce words, or I say things a little bit incorrectly on there, but I don't erase them. I leave them to show people it's okay to make mistakes, that we're all on this learning journey together. And that, the way we're going to get through that is through loving ourselves and loving our communities. And beating ourselves up, it doesn't do anything.
Thank you.
I have a question for Tim.
Go, Chris.
I was really struck by how you reframed your perspective of your parents, and your dad, and you mentioned just the learning about the history and how that really changed. Can you say how did learning that history and those stories help to reframe your understanding of your parents? Because I think there's just something really important about why all of us need to learn about the history and what happened before. So yeah, just curious what you think.
Well, I think naturally, when I began to learn the history about residential schools and the impact that it had on our communities, I at first was very angry. I was hurt, and I went through all of those emotions of grieving. But then the difference for me was I was also involved in a professional atmosphere that was sort of calling on me to take those deep dives into learning. So I connected childhood experiences to the architecture of our brains. And I really tried to understand that who we become as adults isn't just the result of the people who raise us, but it's actually the result of our life experiences. And then I began to sort of really take a deep dive and digging around the childhood life experiences of my parents, and taking a deep dive into the iceberg model, where you're only seeing what's on the surface. And I saw my parents as these two icebergs, where when they were going through life as parents, they were only seeing what was on the surface from them. So it wasn't about that one thing that caused that extreme domestic violence situation that I witnessed as a child, but it was all of this stuff beneath their surface from their childhood that they were sort of just throwing at each other in those not so healthy ways. And that sort of empowered me to not be as angry as I am to them. It created a level of understanding towards my parents. And I didn't blame them, because up until that point, I was blaming them for putting me through those experiences that I was put through, for making me a parent at a very young age. I would say that I was a parent at the age of 7 when my younger siblings were born. But I carried that with me. And when I started to unpack what that meant, and from a larger perspective, I just became empowered to sort of break that cycle. And these are lessons that I share with my siblings as well, that when mom and dad are sort of struggling, that you got to be a little bit open to some understanding. And so I'm trying to impart that knowledge on sort of my spheres of influence as well, because holding on to that resentment and that anger, it also really adds to the woundedness of our spirits that our parents carry for so long, especially if they did go through residential schools.
We're going to finish off. We've talked a lot about fathers. We've talked a lot about parents. Let's talk about kids for a minute. Thomas, what do your kids teach you about being a father?
My kids are my greatest teacher. I learn a lot by watching. And so I'm always watching my kids. And what I love most about my children is that they don't hold anything back. And I think as dads, you might recognize this too. It doesn't matter how much work you have in the day. It doesn't matter what's going on in the world. The kids aren't going to hold anything back. The kids want what they want. And because of that, that pushes me to grow even further. It pushes me to find out who I am in times of discomfort, who I am in times of hardship. And at the same time, they hold me accountable. When I'm having a hard time, I think of that quote that Chris used in the trailer, which was, you don't get to say I'm tired. You don't get to say I quit. And I always keep that in mind when I'm having a hard time is, no, this is it. And, I'm going to be my best self for you. I promise that. Even on the hard days, especially on the hard days.
Chris, what do you learn from your 2-year-old?
Oh my goodness. I would say how to operate with lack of sleep. That's one. But I would definitely say patience, character building. Essentially to what Thomas said of like, how do you retain your best self, even when you're tired, even when you just want to lock up your kid in a crib because they just are irrational, they're screaming, and still find it within yourself to understand, right? Like in that moment to like, okay, it's a toddler. They don't know how to articulate their thoughts clearly and their wants and desires. They don't yet know how to have any foresight and develop that. And that's part of why they're like, throwing a tantrum. And that's not him. It's not you. It's part of learning and growing. And it just takes a lot of repetition to learn anything. We think we're just supposed to learn something and pick it up and then learn it on the first try. Well, as it turns out, learning anything complex or something that you haven't done before takes a lot of time and effort, and we have to be respectful of that. And actually, that's taught me that when I'm learning something new that I've never done before, I have to remind myself, this is going to take a lot of repetition. This is going to take a lot of tears. This is going to take a lot of like time, and that's okay.
I know whose tears we're talking about, Chris. Last word to you. What do you learn from Charm?
Charm motivates me all the time. The work that I do professionally focuses on decolonization all the time. It's something that I can't turn off at the end of the day. And when I think about raising a daughter, and if she grows to be an adult and identifies with the pronouns of she and her, that is going to come with a level of risk in this current narrative that we have for missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls. And so parenting my daughter involves a level of preparing her for protection and protecting herself as she becomes an Indigenous woman, because the risk of something happening to her and nothing being done, I'm getting emotional just talking about that, is so huge. And so she teaches me to be patient, and she also teaches me hope that the work that we are all collectively doing around reconciliation and decolonization has the power to shift our narrative for future generations. And I just want to give a shout out to Rodney Levi, who was recently murdered by the police and who is a father as well, just to call out his name and acknowledge that.
Thank you. We're coming to the end of our time. I just wanted to point out to people that the film will be up on the Zerb site until 11:30 tonight, so you can go back. I encourage you. I learn something every time. I've watched it 3 times. I'm probably I watch it a fourth because I learn something every time I watch it. And Girls Club of Calgary has extended some learning resources that are on your chat there, so you can take a look at that.
And Ken, I did want to add that it is also on CBC Gem, so that you
Great.
can actually go to that app and watch in CBC all across the country.
Wonderful. That's perfect. Thank you, Chris. Gentlemen, thank you. Thank you. Thank you. This has been an amazing process, not just this moment, but in the lead up to it, I've learned so much from you. I congratulate you on a beautiful piece of culture, but also on creating beautiful lives and teaching us how to be better fathers and better humans. And that's terrific. A couple of just quick thank yous before we go. Of course, thanks to the sponsors, the Calgary Foundation, Calgary Queer Arts Society, Hidden Story Productions, TD Bank, TV, YMCA Calgary, and of course the great organization that brought us all together, the Boys and Girls Club of Calgary. And if it makes sense for you and you can make it happen, the generosity that you could show to the Indigenous initiatives at Boys and Girls Clubs of Calgary, please do, so they can continue to do this important work. You can Boys and Girls Clubs of Calgary.ca. Look in the top corner of your screen. There's a donate button that would be really meaningful as a way to acknowledge the experience that you've had. Thank you very much. Thanks to everyone from across the country. I was looking at people from all over the country who were watching, and appreciate it.
Happy Father's Day, everyone.
Happy Father's Day.
Happy Father's Day.
Happy Father's Day.
Thanks again. Bye-bye.
Cheers.